Hey guys, Kelsey here from roughandtumblefarmhouse.com. Today we are talking about rehydrating a sourdough starter and how to do it. I have been a sourdough user for quite a few years now, but I'm kind of a lazy sourdough user and so that has resulted in me needing to start my sourdough starter all from scratch. So let's talk about how you can do that using a dehydrated starter. I'm Kelsey from roughandtumblefarmhouse.com. Every single week I share stories about farming, family food, and fortitude here at our 5-acre homestead in northern Minnesota. So you can absolutely start a sourdough starter just using water and flour and changing it out and discarding it, and it takes, to get like a really good tasting sour starter, it takes a couple of weeks to get there, to get that flavor profile where you kind of want it to be. It is ready to use after a little over a week typically, but it is a process. It doesn't cost anything aside from the flour and water. You are dumping out a fair amount of flour to get it going, but it's totally possible. That's how I've started my last, I think I've had to restart my starter. This is my third time because of various things. One time something got knocked over in the fridge, or a bunch of things got knocked over in the fridge, and it was a really gross disaster. Another time I was just very negligent and it was very warm and some like weird molds got in there. It was a whole thing. So if you are like me and you are wanting to get going with a sourdough starter, a dehydrated starter might be the way to go, because it's really gonna jumpstart that process. It's not wildly expensive or anything, and you're gonna have bread that has that, bread or pancakes, whatever you're making, that has that really great flavor much faster. So the sourdough starter that I got, or the dehydrated starter, I got from my friend Jamie over at Sourdough on the Farm. She has a baking business and also sells some things that kind of go with your sourdough at her website, Sourdough on the Farm. She's located just a little bit north of me here in Minnesota, so it's really cool to partner with another gal here who's kind of has another little homestead and has her own business and everything. So thank you to Jamie so much for sending me a starter, which was so kind to get me going here. And she also sent this absolutely beautiful bowl cover. If you're new to sourdough and haven't done it much, you have a starter that is out on the counter, or you have your bread out on the counter for most of a day, where you are either working the dough every 30 minutes for a while, or you are just letting it rest on your counter. And so these bowl covers are so great because they're reusable, it's beautiful, and she has these available for sale on her website as well. So please stop over and check them out. So this process is not very complicated. You will need your dehydrated starter, you will need a pint-sized mason jar, you need a quart-sized mason jar, a metal spoon, you need a scale that can measure in grams, where if you're gonna be using sourdough starter, it's really great and important that you have a scale that can measure in grams, get a digital scale. You'll need that all-purpose flour, and you'll need some water. If you live in a city, you don't wanna be using chlorinated water, so use something that is filtered to get that out of there. We have well water, but we have a filter here as well that I typically use. So this process only takes 5 days, which is great. And like I said, the other thing that's wonderful about it is if you are starting from scratch just with flour and water, by day 5, you will have something that smells kind of like a sourdough starter. It's getting a little bit sour, yeasty, good smelling, but it isn't going to be nearly as active and ready to rock and roll as it is when you start with a dehydrated starter, for sure. So day 1, you're gonna put your dehydrated starter into a pint-sized jar. You're gonna add a little bit of flour, a little bit of water, mix it up, cover it with a bag, and stick it somewhere nice and warm. You want it to be somewhere that's around 72 degrees. It can be a little bit warmer, preferably not cooler. I had to stick it in a closet in our house, one, to avoid the fruit flies that are still lingering from lots of end of the season garden produce, and 2, because my kitchen tends to be actually kind of cool, but we do have a closet that stays pretty toasty. It's got a heat vent in there. So that's where I stuck my starter. Days 2 and days 3, you're gonna add just a little bit more flour, a little bit more water, mix it up about the same amount for those 2 days. And again, stick it somewhere overnight, let it sit and start doing its thing, start waking that dehydrated starter up. Day 4, you're about going to double the amount of flour and water that you are adding to that starter. It's really gonna start kicking it into high gear here. Then on day 5, we're gonna add even more flour, even more water. And this is our last day that we have to feed this starter before we can now bake with it starting the next day. So at day 6, your starter is absolutely ready to use in all sorts of recipes. I went ahead and made a loaf of sourdough bread. I was so excited to get back into some bread baking. And of course, it's been a little while. I'm a little rusty about getting my timing right to get that perfect loaf. So it's a less than perfect loaf, but it still tasted absolutely delicious. And then I made sourdough pancakes the next day. It was so nice to have that starter up and running right away. It was just great. So some pros to using a dehydrated starter is that it is ready to rock and roll in just a few days, like I said, versus it takes a while when you're using just flour and water to start your own. One thing that's nice when you start your own is you are developing your own kind of flavor profile, but that's also a positive if you have someone who has a really good developed starter. It's just gonna have a thicker, fuller flavor profile faster. So if you have any questions or you're interested in getting a dehydrated starter, please stop over at Sourdough on the Farm. Jamie has everything you need, including these absolutely beautiful bowl covers that are so nice to use. It's always great when you have a tool that you're using a lot to have something that's not only functional but beautiful. So these are really great to use, and the starter is happening, and I'm so happy to have some good sourdough back at my house. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next week for more farming, family food, and fortitude here at our Rough and Tumble farmhouse.